This is the Unique Scotland podcast with exclusive ScottishVisits.co.uk.
Hello, this is John Harbour of Exclusive Scottish Visits Luxury Tours, and welcome to my podcast, Unique Scotland, the go-to podcast for all things Scottish. I'm recording this from Aberlady, a small village near Edinburgh, and it's a warmish day, or as we say in Scotland, it's close, at around 16 degrees centigrade or 64 degrees Fahrenheit. The clouds are high, there's been a wee spit of rain, but nothing to write home about. I actually had Minnie, our spaniel, out for a walk earlier, and it was lovely to dodge the showers as we made our way along the shore of Aberlady Bay's Nature Reserve, which takes a route along a path at the edge of Kilspindie Golf Course. Now, before I tell you what's coming shortly, I'm just so excited that my Unique Scotland podcast, this very podcast that you are listening to, received a highly commended award at the Scottish Podcast of the Year Awards in Glasgow last Friday, on the 25th of July. I'm absolutely delighted, especially when you consider that I was up against some BBC productions. It's quite an accolade and made even more special because all my family attended, making it an exceptional evening out. And by the way, there's some photos on my webpage. I have to say I'm still buzzing, but let's get on with this episode. Today's podcast follows a theme from my last one, when I had the pleasure of talking with Clare Campbell, owner of the Prickly Thistle clothing design brand, whose heritage weaving mill has caused quite a sensation, not just in Scotland, but around the world. After that interview, I thought I'd talk a little more about her craft, which has been so important to Scotland over the centuries, and about just how diverse it really is. In other words, I'm going to delve a little deeper into weaving in Scotland, those golden strands running right through the country's history. And you're going to hear from a hand loom weaver from the Isle of Harris, Donald John Mackay, and how he coped with an order from Nike for 20,000 plus metres of material. And I'm not just talking about wool. Human ingenuity knows no bounds, and you'll hear about crops that are grown, processed and woven into cloth. And did you know, for example, that many of the wagons in America's Wild West in the 19th century were covered with a woven canvas from Dundee on Scotland's east coast, and that material, which was jute, was grown in India. I'll also be featuring at the end of the podcast a group of family and friends who visited Scotland earlier this year to take a big item off their bucket list. This was Dan Delmerico with his daughters Amelia and Kathleen. Sadly, Dan, a US veteran, was diagnosed with lung cancer in 2025 and wanted to come to Scotland to make memories with his family and friends. Well, they certainly achieved that, and you'll hear from Dan and his good friend Laurie later in the podcast. Don't forget, you can find me on most media channels, and you can get the links from my website, exclusivescottishvisits.co.uk, where you can also see some wonderful photographs of my travels. So, wherever you are in the world, I'd now like you to relax and settle in for this fascinating look into weaving in Scotland. As we look at weaving in Scotland, it might help to separate two stages in the long history of textiles. Some of the earliest known fibres are flax, and they're fibres from Zudzuana Cave in western Georgia, in the southern Caucasus, dating back more than 30,000 years. That belongs to the later part of the Old Stone Age, when small groups of modern humans lived as hunter-gatherers during the Ice Age. By contrast, some of the earliest preserved woven cloth comes from Neolithic Çatalhöyük in present-day Turkey. That belonged to a very different world, a large, early farming settlement occupied around 9,000 years ago, when people were living in permanent mud brick houses, growing crops, keeping animals, and developing increasingly specialised crafts. Scotland's own story begins much later. Not because people lack textile skills, but because fragile fibres and fabrics rarely survive in Scottish climatic conditions. Even so, archaeologists have found traces showing that prehistoric Scotland worked with cord, plant fibres, twined fabrics and early woven cloth thousands of years ago. Some of the oldest preserved Scottish textiles date to the Bronze Age, around 2,000 years ago, and some of the earliest evidence for woven cloth survives as impressions on pottery. In other words, the difference is not between Scotland having textiles and not having them, but between what's survived and what's been lost over time. From these early beginnings, textile making in Scotland grew out of daily necessity, and you can picture it. A croft or a cottage with the light fading outside, a fire burning low, hands still busy with the fibre, spindle and loom before the day is done. Wool, and in some places plant fibre such as flax, could be spun and woven close to home. And over many centuries, that practical household work developed into a cottage industry. Before the Industrial Revolution, much of Scotland's cloth was still produced in villages, crofting communities and small towns, with spinning and weaving carried out by hand in or beside the home. Families turned local raw materials into yarn, cloth, blankets and clothing, sometimes for their own use and sometimes for sale or exchange. And long before factory production, Scottish weaving was already an organised domestic economy, rooted in climate, livestock, local skill and regional trade, and laying the foundations for the famous textile traditions that came later. So in effect, weaving was part of everyday life in Scotland, long before mechanised production. But what I found fascinating is that Scottish cloth was never made from one single material. Different fibres produced different fabrics, and each had its own geography, labour and economic history. Wool was tied to grazing land and pastoral life. Flax depended upon cultivation and linen manufacture. Cotton and later jute were imported fibres linked to global trade, industrial machinery, and the rise of places such as Paisley and Dundee. So, to understand weaving in Scotland, we need to think not just about looms, but about very different fibres that fed them, and the regions and communities built around them. Let's look at wool first, and this fabric was the most widespread and, in many ways, the most characteristic Scottish fibre. In the Highlands and Islands of Scotland, where the land often suited grazing better than arable farming, sheep provided a renewable source of fleece that could be turned into warm, durable cloth. That made wool especially important in these areas. The process began with a shearing, usually in late spring or early summer, when the fleece was cut from the animal. The raw wool, which contained grease, dirt and bits of plant matter from the hillside or moor, had to be cleaned. After washing, it was scouring. It was dried and opened out by hand. Then came carding or combing, which separated and aligned the fibre so they could be drawn into loose rolls ready for spinning. In earlier periods, spinning was done with a spindle and whorl, and later with spinning wheels, producing yarn that could range from fine thread to thicker, more robust wool for plaids or blankets, or stocking cloth and tweeds. Once spun, the yarn was warped onto a loom and woven into cloth, which might then be dyed or finished, depending upon its intended use. And if you can imagine the soundscape of it, it's wonderfully physical. The snip of the shears in the summer, the smell of the wet fleece, the rhythm of carding, and the steady clack of the loom turning something rough and raw into something beautiful, useful, and lasting. Woolen weaving was closely associated with the Highlands and Islands, but is also crucial in the borders, where wool later supported specialist weaving and commercial tweed production in towns such as Hoyick, Galashiels, and Selkirk. And I've mentioned before in previous podcasts that I once worked as a warper in a woolen mill in Galashiels when I was just a boy of 16. In the Outer Hebrides, wool eventually fed the Harris tweed tradition. In short, wool linked Scotland's environment directly to its textile culture. The hills fed the sheep fed the spinning wheel, and the spinning wheel fed the loom. Turning to flax, which produced linen, this followed a very different path from wool. It depended much more on arable land, seasonal cultivation, and the careful processing of the plant stem. Instead of coming from an animal, flax comes from a crop that had to be sown, grown, and pulled from the ground, then dried, and then worked through a long series of labour-intensive stages before any thread could be made. It was more associated with the eastern and lowland Scotland, where farming conditions were more favourable, and became important in places such as Fife, Angus, Perthshire, and the wider Dundee region. Once harvested, the flax plants were not cut, but pulled up by the roots so the fibres in the stem stayed as long as possible. The seed heads were removed and the stalks were then retted, in other words processed in water or damp conditions, so the woody matter around the fibre would begin to break down. After retting came drying, breaking and scutching, where the brittle stems were crushed and beaten to free the fibre. Finally the flax was heckled or drawn through combs to straighten the fibres and separate the finest strands from the coarser waste. When I first heard that flax was heckled, I imagined the poor fibre being shouted at by the mill workers. Anyway, only after all of that could it be spun into linen thread. Linen spinning demanded control and patience because flax fibres are less elastic than wool and harder to manage. You can almost feel the difference. Flax is less forgiving, more exacting, and every stage demanded care if the final cloth was to be smooth, strong, and worth the effort. And when woven, linen produced a strong, smooth cloth, well suited to shirts, household textiles, and finer domestic fabrics. Linen always had a long history in Scotland, but by the 18th century it had become one of the country's most important commercial textiles. If we now turn to jute, that was different again, because it was not a native Scottish product at all. It was an imported fibre that transformed one particular city, Dundee. Raw jute came largely from Bengal, which is now India and Bangladesh, and its rise in Scotland belongs above all to the industrial era rather than the older domestic world of cottage weaving. By the 19th century, Dundee had become the great Scottish centre of jute manufacture, indeed one of the best-known jute cities in the world. And I remember, as a boy at school, our geography lessons where we learned about Dundee being the city of the 3 J's, jam, jute and journalism. Jam because of all the soft fruit that was grown in the local area. Journalism because of the printing presses that produced very popular children's magazines, such as the Dandy and Beano at the time. Jute because of the large number of jute factories churning out the amazing fibre. Within Dundee itself, mills clustered, especially in the areas such as Lochee, Blackness, and along the Dens Burn, where water supply, transport, and factory development supported large-scale production. Unlike wool or flax, jute was not usually prepared in the home for small-scale weaving. It arrived in bales and had to be softened with oil and water, carded, drawn, spun, and then woven by machinery into coarse but useful cloth. The resulting yarn was used not for fine clothing, but for sacks, bagging, backing cloth, rope, industrial fabrics, and other hard-wearing products. It's even said that many of the wagons of the American Wild West were covered in canvas made in Dundee. And this is where the story shifts in scale. Instead of a hearth and a hand loom, imagine the smoke, the noise, and the motion of industrial Dundee. Huge bales of raw fibre arriving by ship to a busy port, mills smoking and thundering, and entire districts built around factory labour. Jute changed both the scale and the social character of Scottish textile production. It was tied to empire, shipping, industrial capital, and factory labour rather than to crofts or household looms. Dundee's jute mills employed vast numbers of workers, many of them women and children, and the fibre became central to the city's economy. And why Dundee in particular? Well, Dundee was already one of the UK's leading textile towns, with flax being the main product. Indeed, during the mid-1800s, Dundee was hailed as the country's leading linen manufacture centre, and as I mentioned before, linen comes from flax. So there was already an experienced weaving workforce. There was a city with its own waterfront ready to receive imported goods such as jute. There was also a whaling station in Dundee, and to some extent the whaling industry proved to be very useful, as whale oil, of which there was a steady supply, was one of the best fibre softeners on the market. So it's not surprising that Dundee, which was historically dominated by the manufacture of jute products, became known as Jutopolis. If we look at cotton, it offers a useful comparison because, like jute, it was largely an imported fibre. But unlike jute, its preparation was less factory intensive, and it could be spun and woven into much softer and finer fabrics. Cotton manufacturing first appeared in Scotland in the late 1770s, with early mills at places such as Pennycook and Rothesay, before the industry spread quickly across the west of Scotland and into mill communities such as New Lanark. Raw cotton reached Scotland through Atlantic trade, first from the West Indies, and after American independence, increasingly from the southern United States, coming through ports such as Glasgow and helping to drive textile growth in the west central belt. That history has to be faced honestly because much of the raw cotton that powered the British cotton industry was grown by enslaved labour on plantations. That's now recognised as part of Scotland's past. Once imported, the fibre was cleaned, opened and carded so the short, fluffy fibres lay more evenly. It was then drawn out and spun into yarn by increasingly mechanised machinery such as water frames and spinning mules, before being wound, warped and woven into cloth. In many mills, spinning and weaving were linked to the bleaching, dyeing, printing or thread making. Cotton became especially important in Paisley, Glasgow and Lanarkshire, and above all at New Lanark. The New Lanark mill was founded in 1785 by David Dale and Richard Arkwright, and later made famous by Robert Owen. Under Owen's management, New Lanark became internationally known for working conditions that were revolutionary for the age. Decent housing, schooling for workers' children, early childcare, healthcare and a village store selling good quality goods at fair prices. In an age when many mills treated labour as cheap and disposable, Owen tried to prove that industry could be profitable without being utterly brutal, and that made New Lanark famous far beyond Scotland. Owen's reforms did not make mill work easy, but they were far more humane than the harsh factory norms of the early Industrial Revolution, and they helped make New Lanark a model industrial community known across Europe. The mills themselves operated from 1786 until 1968, and after decades of restoration, the Visitor Centre opened in 1990, helping turn the site into one of Scotland's most impressive heritage attractions. New Lanark was later recognised by UNESCO as a World Heritage Site in 2001, in recognition of its importance in both industrial and social history. Now, I have to say that I've visited New Lanark a number of times with clients, and the site is mightily impressive, with access to the original mills, the shops and even the types of homes built by the owner for the workers. New Lanark was very much ahead of its time in looking after its workers, and I'd strongly recommend a visit if you're in the area, and it's only an hour south of Glasgow and Edinburgh as it happens. Other mill communities, including Blantyre, Katrine, Deanston and parts of Renfrewshire, also played their part in the wider cotton economy. And because cotton could be made into finer, lighter and more washable cloth than many woolens, it was used for muslins, calicos, prints, sewing thread and other everyday textiles. And from these fabrics came shirts, petticoats, dresses, aprons, children's clothes, caps, underwear, bed hangings, printed furnishings and countless other items that brought cotton into ordinary life. Yet the industry's wider history was shaped by Atlantic conflict. The American War of Independence did not destroy Scottish cotton manufacture. The industry, as it happens, was only just beginning, but it did help redirect Scottish trade away from older colonial patterns and encourage merchants to look for new imports. In the longer term, American cotton increasingly replaced West Indian supplies and became the main raw material for Scottish mills. That dependence later proved dangerously fragile during the American Civil War of 1861 to 1865, as Union blockades choked off exports from the Confederate South. Scottish mills, like those in Lanarkshire, faced what became known as the cotton famine. Supplies dried up, prices soared, mills went on to short time or closed, and cotton towns such as Paisley experienced severe unemployment and poverty. The industry recovered somewhat when supplies resumed, but the Civil War exposed just how vulnerable Scottish cotton manufacture had become to events overseas. Combined with growing competition from Lancashire and foreign producers, that shock helped push the Scottish cotton industry into long-term decline later in the 19th century. And that matters not just economically but socially too, because cotton did not merely fill mills with workers, it changed what people wore and how ordinary people dressed. In effect, cotton weaving changed Scottish fashion because it made clothing lighter, softer, cheaper and more varied than many older woolen garments. Fabrics such as muslin, calico and printed cotton helped shift dresses away from heavier traditional textiles towards garments that were easier to wash and easier to wear and better suited to changing tastes. And that mattered socially as well as stylistically because cotton widened access to fashion. People who could never have afforded luxury silks or imported shawls could now buy attractive patterned cloth made in Scottish mills. In the late 18th and early 19th centuries, light cotton muslin dresses became highly fashionable, and in Western Scotland the rise of Paisley shawls showed how Scottish weaving could absorb global influence and turn them into a recognisable local fashion industry. The pattern we now call Paisley did not begin in Scotland. Its roots lie in Persian and Indian design traditions, where the curved teardrop motif was known as botte or buta, and became especially associated with luxurious Kashmiri shawls. Now, these shawls reached Europe through imperial trade and quickly became fashionable among wealthy women, but the originals were expensive and difficult to obtain. And the popularity was strengthened further when Queen Victoria took an interest in Paisley shawls and purchased a number of them during a difficult period for the trade, helping to raise their prestige and profile. Scottish manufacturers, especially in Paisley, began producing their own versions in wool, silk and later cotton, adapting the motif for European markets and making it available on a much wider scale. During the early 19th century, Paisley became one of the most important centres for the production of these imitation shawls, and the town became so closely identified with them that its name gradually attached itself to the design. In other words, the Paisley pattern is not Scottish in origin, but the name reflects the extraordinary success of Scottish manufacturers in popularising and bringing it to the masses. In that sense, cotton did more than provide a new raw material. It opened fashion up to more people, changed what ordinary people could wear, and linked a west of Scotland mill town to a much older global textile story. Two of the best-known products of Scottish weaving are tartan and tweed. Tartan, with its intersecting bands of colour, is closely associated with Highland dress, clan identity and ceremonial tradition, although its meanings and uses have changed over time. And of all Scottish cloths, tartan may be the one that people can picture instantly. Colour crossing colour, a swish of pleats, the flash of a plaid in the wind, and a fabric that somehow manages to feel both personal and theatrical. I've gone into tartan in some depth in previous podcasts, so I won't repeat all of that here. Tweed, by contrast, began as a practical woolen cloth, developed for hard outdoor use in Scotland's damp and changeable climate. Early tweeds were rough, sturdy, and often hand-woven in earthy mixed colours that helped the wearer blend into a moorland pasture and heather. They were made from wool and usually woven in a twill structure, which gave the cloth strength, flexibility, and that familiar diagonal pattern in the weave. The very name tweed may come from the Scots word tweel, meaning twill, although tradition also links it to the river Tweed in the Borders, where the cloth became strongly associated with textile production. If tartan has something of ceremony about it, then tweed feels quite different. It's quieter, it's tougher, more weather-beaten. It belongs to the hillside, the stalking path, the stone dyke, the smell of rain on wool, and the long practical relationship between cloth and landscape in Scotland. Over the 19th century, tweed developed from a working fabric into one of Scotland's most distinctive commercial textiles. It grew in importance in the Scottish Borders, where towns such as Hoyk, Galashiels and Selkirk built strong reputations for woolen manufacture and patterned cloth. At the same time, tweed became closely tied to country sports and estate life. Landowners wanted durable fabric for stalking and shooting and fishing, and many began commissioning their own estate tweeds in colours suited to the local landscape. And that helped turn tweed into something more than just useful cloth. It became a marker, a place, status and rural identity. And of course, royal interest also played an important part in raising its profile. And when Queen Victoria and Prince Albert bought Balmoral in the 1850s, they didn't simply acquire a Highland retreat. They helped turn Scotland itself into a royal stage set of tartan, tweed, stalking, lodges and estate life. Their enthusiasm for Highland dress and country living gave Scottish textiles enormous cultural prestige. Prince Albert himself is closely associated with the design of the Balmoral tweed, and royal approval helped make estate tweeds fashionable far beyond Scotland. What had once been practical cloth for weather and work now carried the glamour of royalty, landscape and leisure. Later, members of the royal family continued to favour tweed for outdoor wear, reinforcing its image as practical, aristocratic and unmistakably tied to the Scottish countryside. So, together, tartan and tweed show how Scottish weaving combines symbolism with utility. These fabrics are expressive, but they're also deeply functional. Perhaps the most famous example of Scottish weaving is Harris tweed, produced in the Outer Hebrides, those distant islands that sit out in the Atlantic to the west of the Scottish mainland. And its reputation rests on more than romance or branding. Harris tweed is prized for its quality because it's dense, durable woolen cloth made to withstand hard wear, rough weather and repeated use. Its strength comes partly from the character of the wool and partly from the way the cloth is made. Genuine Harris tweed is woven from pure virgin wool, and the wool is dyed at fibre stage before spinning rather than simply dyeing the finished yarn. And that allows different shades to be blended together in subtle combinations, giving the cloth its remarkable depth of colour and its close visual link to the heather-strewn moorland and the deep sea blue of the islands. The finished fabric is not only warm and tough, but visually complex, with a richness and variation that machine-made imitations just fail to reproduce. There isn't one unique breed called a Harris sheep, but certain breeds have been especially important to the wool used for Harris tweed, above all Scottish Cheviot, with some use also of the Scottish Blackface and Jacob sheep. And these breeds are valued because they produce resilient, springy fibres, well suited to a hard-wearing tweed. So the quality of Harris tweed comes from a combination of raw material, skilled preparation and careful control at every stage of production. And what makes it exceptional is not only that quality, but the legal protection around it as well. Harris tweed is the only fabric in the world protected by its own Act of Parliament. To bear the Harris tweed name, the cloth must be made from pure virgin wool, dyed and spun in the Outer Hebrides, finished there and hand-woven by islanders in their own homes. And that last point also explains why Harris tweed largely escaped the full force of the Industrial Revolution. The Outer Hebrides were geographically remote, economically different from the industrial mainland, and deeply rooted in crofting life, where weaving remained tied to household income rather than to large factory systems. Industrial methods did affect some stages of production, especially spinning and finishing, but the weaving itself stayed domestic for much longer because the local economy, driven by a scattered settlement pattern and the value of skilled home production, all favoured continuity over complete factory takeover. Later, when imitation tweeds threatened the industry, legal protection helped preserve that older structure. A striking modern example of that adaptability came in the early 2000s when the Harris weaver Donald John Mackay of Luscantyre, who, as it happens, weaves in a wooden shed in his back garden on an old hand loom, he received an unexpected approach from Nike. The company was looking for Harris tweed for a redesigned trainer or sneaker, and what began as a request for samples quickly turned into a huge order. And contemporary reports suggest the project grew to almost 20,000 metres of cloth, far beyond what one home weaver could produce. So Donald turned to Derek Murray and the Shawboss Mill network for help. The tweed was used in a special version of a Nike shoe called the Terminator Trainer, and this episode has since become part of the wider story of Harris tweed's modern revival. In that sense, Harris tweed is a remarkable example not simply of survival, but of selective adaptation. An island cloth woven by hand in small island sheds, yet capable of reaching a global market while still keeping hand weaving at the heart of its identity and livelihood. Now, I visited the Outer Hebrides in April, just gone, that's April 26, if you're listening to this much later, and I made a point of going through Harris, and I actually stopped to meet Donald John Mackay in his weaving shed. And it literally is a small wooden shed, but the views from the windows over Luscantyre Beach with the Atlantic beyond are absolutely breathtaking. Anyway, Donald was kind enough to take a break from his weaving, and we had a really good chat, and I started by asking how long he'd lived here.
Close on 70 years.
Oh, Lord, right.
Yes, yes.
Were you born and bred in Harris?
No, and in Harris, yes, but south of here, in Leverborough. So that's my home village.
Mm. When did you get into weaving?
My dad was a weaver in Leverborough.
Right.
So as time went on, through school, left school, and then I moved here with my aunt. Mm-hmm. This was her place.
Right.
So then, which would have been the mid to late 60s,
yes,
a very different place then as it is to now.
Yes.
And getting back and forth. So there came a time, after a while leaving school, I would have to think about what was I going to do with myself for the rest of my life.
Yes.
I did have some basic knowledge of weaving from my dad. My auntie said that I should start here. Weaving as a piece worker. Mm-hmm. That is where you're weaving for one of the bigger mills.
Yes.
So
right.
a self-employed piece worker.
Right.
So that was in 1970.
Wow. And that piece of machinery we've just seen operating, which is wonderful. How long has that been here?
Oh, that's a 1970 loom. And that's my third loom. And it's been here since 84.
So you've been weaving since a young boy, effectively?
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
Now,
while at school helping Dad. And then he was here, not just a little over a year, when my auntie set me up with not so much this part of the shed, but what you wear and the loom is that part. So that was built in late '68.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's the third loom you're saying?
Yep. First of all, my auntie bought me a loom, and then it was, I don't know why, it simply made me troublesome. I could have had something to do with it because I was young. But then when my dad retired, I got his loom, the one we learned on, and that was a fantastic loom. But it came a time when it needed a part. That was the part then was going to cost £380 plus VAT. I'm talking of the around about 80s.
Okay, expensive then, yeah.
Very, but it was good. So somebody said to me, "Oh, there's a loom could be going." And for just perhaps a little more than that, and it's brand new.
Yes,
the whole loom.
Oh wow! So you changed it into, and this is the one you bought.
Yes, this loom I took here in about I think March, April '84.
Right. Now this loom, your fame goes before you, Donald, because of course we know that you were connected with Nike, the Nike.
Oh yes.
Tell us how that came about.
Well, it came about because at that time I was an independent producer. A small producer.
Of Harris Tweed.
Of Harris Tweed.
Official Harris Tweed.
Official Harris Tweed, yeah. And then it came to us through the Harris Tweed Authority because Nike had approached them and they were wanting somebody that would do the smallest possible run of their own design. Now, in them days, we would do 25 meters of the customer's own design.
Yeah.
And, okay, so that was the starting point.
Yes, okay.
And now I didn't have much to do with them because it was my late wife Maureen who was handling all this.
Yeah.
And I was told. And then when it came to the stage of, I would have to see what they had in mind. Because I'm restricted by the loom and by my own experience and knowledge of.
Yes.
I'm not an expert.
No.
So, okay, so they sent us a printout of what they had in mind. Yes. Possible, yeah, very possible. And so for that, they wanted, it took 6 colours. What they had in mind was 6 colours, 3 in the warp, 3 in the weft. So they wanted snippets or finger hanks of the colours that I would be using for their tweed.
Yeah.
So that was plus 6 snippets of our own best-selling tweeds.
Right.
So we sent the yarn plus 6 business card size samples of tweed. And they ordered in the end?
Well, that was back and forth for quite a while. They picked one of ours. They didn't want to forget about their own design. They want one of ours, and they started off with this one, with this one.
It's lovely. I mean, it's a lovely shoe, beautiful.
With these sprays coming from down there.
Right.
Yeah, the Macherland.
The Macherland,
yep.
The sort of a light green one.
Anyway, they took that and they said, so they wanted 2 meters. So that was, the first 2 meters was sent to their head office in Oregon.
Oregon.
So that was there, and then weeks or whatever later, they got back to us and said that they wanted another 2 meters of the same tweed sent to, let's say, Hong Kong or somewhere.
Yes.
It was, yeah.
Yes.
Okay, so then all these, it then became 10 meters, same tweed, but go to 5 different places in the Far East.
Okay.
Yep. So that was going, and then for a while, then the 10 meters became 40 meters.
Okay.
To each place.
Yes.
So in the end, I had produced about 800 meters.
800 meters.
Yes.
For Nike.
Now, up to this point, we didn't know what they had in mind or what they were going to do with it.
Yes.
It didn't bother us anyway.
Yeah, of course.
They were taken, and up to that point, they always were good. So then, early in 2004, they then came back. Marine came in, and with the email saying this is Nike, they're wanting 950 meters of the 875 of the reference number of the tweed. Okay, well, off the top of my head, then for me and my own to do, I would need to get somebody to help me with a few rolls, and then I could do. Okay, but I said, it was more step. I said, leave it as now, we'll sort it later on tonight. But I'll need to get somebody to help me doing a few rolls, pulls. Who I didn't know who, because I didn't want to engage anybody or reply anybody.
Yeah.
So then we went and had lunch, everything. So I was back out to the loom. Maureen would have gone back to her old wee corner at the computer. So later on in the afternoon, she came out and she said, another email. So it's Nike again. They made a mistake. It's 9,000.
No.
500 meters they want. Well, that just blows it totally out of foul.
So how did you cope with that?
No, they wanted a reply or an acceptance of the order.
Yes, of course.
And I said, well, we certainly can't do that. And in them days, the industry was on a 3-day week with very, very little doing.
And on the island, you mean?
On the island?
Tweed, yes.
Oh, yes.
Uh-huh.
We were busy, but...
Yeah.
So I said, I'd have to go and see Derek. No, Derek owned the mill, or the mills, a few of them anyway, at that time. So, and to see what if they would be willing to take it on.
Yes.
Anyway, so, he was good. I said, no, whatever you do, accept that right away.
Really?
And say yes to anything they tell you. I'll ask you. And then I'll be home on Wednesday night. The two of you come and see me on Thursday. And we'll make a date. 2 p.m. at the office on Thursday. I know the mill will be closed, but we'll be there waiting for you. So that was it.
Wow.
Myself and Maureen went up on the Thursday. They were there. Derek Murray, who was the older, and his brother, who was next in line, Kenneth. Maureen had everything that she had, paperwork regarding the Nike thing. Derek was just amazed the work Maureen had done and how she got, and the price she secured.
Shocked.
Yep. And that was it. So instead of us, which we were busy enough, we know there's a limit to what I can do, one man.
Yes.
And by not getting it was no loss to us as such. But if it was going to be a huge plus, and we would feel good if we were able to do something for the industry.
Yes,
that supported us all our lives.
Absolutely.
So we were quite happy to hand it over. But no, he wouldn't have it.
No?
No. You're keeping it. You work for it. We'll help you deliver it.
Oh, wow. So he basically turned his mills.
To our disposal.
Plus you at your disposal.
Yep.
So that's just an amazing story.
It is.
It is. And I've actually got two of the Nike trainers in front of me at the moment. One beautiful sort of sea greenish, and the other one purple, which are just
which we call the heather.
You call the heather, of course. So the
heather.
The azure sea green and the heather, wonderful.
Yes.
And so when did the order finish? You obviously cleared the order. You finished the order for them.
The order, well, after all that came, 9,500 meters. Nike were so pleased with the feedback they were getting from their agents, I don't know what, so much so that they were adding to the order.
So they just kept adding to it?
Yes. At the end, it reached 20,000 meters.
No, 20,000 meters?
One tweed.
Good Lord. All over the world.
All over, well, yes, indeed.
Well, you certainly started something, Robert.
But that was this one. And then Nike came back again, and with another order for but in that order was 2 tweeds.
So nothing to do with shoes. This is a different.
No, that for shoes.
Oh, for the shoes again.
That's it. Yeah. The sports boots or something. Yeah.
Sports boots. Yeah. So, and we see you today still in your shed with that wonderful loom.
Yes.
And in fact, we met Matilda on the beach as we were walking down Luscantire Beach today, and she said you've now retired.
I am retired.
But I
was thinking about it anyway.
We walked into that shed. You're still using that loom, actually.
Yeah, I am.
Well, that's amazing. And the best thing to do, listen, what do you do when you get to a certain age?
Exactly.
There's no point.
Exactly.
You need something to get up for in the morning, don't you?
Yes, you do. So that is it.
Thank you very much indeed.
Very well.
Well, I much appreciate that.
Yes.
Not honestly, that's great. That's absolutely super.
And that was Donald John Mackay of Luscantire, the Isle of Harris. And thank you so much, John, for giving of your time to share this amazing story with us today. What an amazing gentleman. Well, moving from Harris in the Outer Hebrides back to the mainland, all this hand spinning and weaving did, of course, change dramatically when the Industrial Revolution came along. Mechanised spinning first, and then mechanised weaving. It shifted textile production away from cottages and into mills, powered first by water, then later steam. In practical terms, that meant work once spread across households and controlled by families increasingly became concentrated in larger workplaces run by owners, overseers, and of course the clock. Many women who had earned money by spinning at home found their labour devalued or displaced. Some moved into mills, where the work was faster, noisier, and much more closely supervised. Others lost an important source of household income. Handloom weavers, on the other hand, experienced a more uneven transition. At first, some benefited from the growing supply of machine-spun yarn, but over time, power looms and factory production drove prices down and put pressure on earnings. In many districts, that led to unemployment, falling wages, insecurity, and sometimes outright poverty. And you can almost hear the human change in that story. The quieter rhythms of home production giving way to the din of machinery, the factory bell replacing the habits of the household, and craft increasingly measured not by skill, but by speed, output and profit. Instead of fitting textile work around rhythms of farming and family, workers increasingly had to adapt to fixed hours, factory discipline and the demands of industrial towns. Yet the effects were not entirely uniform. Industrialisation created new centres of employment in places like cotton, linen, wool, jute and finishing trades, and it expanded Scotland's textile economy on a much larger scale. Even so, for many traditional spinners and weavers, the change was deeply disruptive. It certainly weakened older household economies, and it divided communities between those who adapted and those who were left behind, and eventually turned a craft rooted in domestic skill into an industry shaped by profit and mass production. Well, as we have just been discussing, handloom weaving did not disappear entirely in places such as the Outer Hebrides, and also in heritage sites that preserve traditional methods, which today remain part of Scotland's cultural identity. And that balance between industry and handcraft is one of the most interesting features of Scottish weaving. It reminds us that textile history is not simply about machines replacing people, but about adaptation, continuity, and local resilience. Today, weaving in Scotland is not one thing, but several overlapping worlds. Part of it is still industrial, with larger companies producing luxury woolens, tweeds, tartans, cashmere, furnishing fabrics and technical textiles for international markets. Part of it is small scale and entrepreneurial, with newer mills and studio businesses making shorter runs, bespoke tartans, limited edition cloth and products that emphasise traceability, sustainability and local identity. And part of it remains genuinely hand-woven, especially where the process itself is central to the value of the cloth. So modern Scottish weaving is best understood not as the survival of one old tradition, but as a living network stretching from advanced finishing plants and established mills to island weaving sheds, heritage looms and contemporary craft studios. Looking at the larger mill landscape, the most important concentration is still in the Scottish borders, especially in and around Howick, Selkirk, Galashiels and Peebles. That region remains the historic heartland of Scotland's luxury woolen and cashmere trade, with firms such as Johnsons of Elgin operating major manufacturing in Howick, and with companies such as Lochcarron of Scotland and Selkirk continuing the long border association with tartan and woven cloth. Howick in particular is still strongly identified with high-end woolens and cashmere, while the wider borders retains a cluster of textile knowledge and specialist production built up over generations. Beyond the borders, Elgin in Moray remains another major textile centre through Johnsons of Elgin, and it has a historic mill there, while Dundee is associated less with hand weaving than with industrial textile finishing and waxed cotton through Halley Stevenson's. In the Outer Hebrides, the Harris Tweed industry forms a different kind of modern mill system. Spinning, dyeing and then finishing are carried out by the island mills, while the weaving itself is done separately by registered weavers in their homes, as we've seen with Donald John Mackay. And there's 3 working Harris Tweed mills in the islands, including Harris Tweed Hebrides in Shawbost on Lewis and Carloway Mill in Carloway on Lewis, each linked to a wider network of island hand weavers. So the larger Scottish picture today is not dominated by giant Victorian-style textile cities, but by a smaller number of specialised regional centres producing premium cloth for global fashion and interior markets. Alongside these bigger names, Scotland also has a smaller mills and independent weaving business that matters precisely because they work on a more intimate scale and often place values, locality and storytelling at the centre of the cloth. One of the clearest examples is Prickly Thistle, based in Eventon on the Black Isle, near to Inverness, which presents itself as the only tartan weaving mill in the Highland region. And in my last podcast, I interviewed the mill owner, Clare Campbell, and she explained what makes Prickly Thistle so special. It's not simply a small mill producing tartan in smaller quantities. It's a consciously values-led brand built around the idea that tartan should still mean identity, place and responsibility in the modern world. And of course, Clare often frames the business as a form of Highland rebellion, a challenge to fast fashion, anonymous production, and the idea that traditional cloth must either become a mass-market souvenir or disappear altogether. At Prickly Thistle, tartan is treated not as a fixed relic, but as a living language for telling contemporary stories, whether personal, communal, environmental, or even political. Clare has spoken about being a custodian of craft rather than simply a producer of goods, and about resisting the logic that people should be replaced wherever possible by automation. In that sense, Prickly Thistle stands for something larger than itself, a modern Highland attempt to reconnect weaving with community, labour, and long-term cultural value. If we look beyond Prickly Thistle, we can see other small-scale and hand-loomed weaving communities scattered across the country. Outside the islands, handloom weaving survives in smaller but important pockets on the mainland. On the outskirts of Edinburgh, for example, Clare Campbell maintains an atelier where a team of hand weavers produce bespoke hand-woven pieces on vintage floor looms, showing that high-end slow weaving still has a place in contemporary Scotland. In Fife, Newborough handloom weavers continue the craft on a small scale, while in Stirling, Radical Weavers has become known for studio-based teaching and participatory weaving experiences that introduce new audiences to tartan and to loom work. Heritage sites also play a part in keeping the practice visible and understandable. At Weaver's Cottage in Kilbarchan, visitors can still see handloom weaving demonstrated on a historic loom in a setting that recreates pre-industrial working life, preserving both the technique and the social world that once surrounded it. So, although most Scottish weaving today does not take place in the same dispersed domestic way that it once did, handloom weaving has by no means vanished. It survives in the Hebridean industry, in specialist ateliers and workshops, and in heritage settings where the craft is still being practiced rather than merely remembered. I have to say, my journey in researching weaving in Scotland has shown me that it's more than a textile tradition. It's a way of reading the country's history through cloth, beginning with the fragile traces of early fibres and woven fabrics in prehistoric Scotland, which grows into a domestic economy in which households turn fleece and plant fibres into useful cloth by hand. Over time, of course, different materials shape different regions and different ways of life. Wool, for example, belonged most strongly to the Highlands, Islands and the Borders, whereas linen belonged to the cultivated eastern lowlands. Cotton to the west central mill towns and jute to industrial Dundee, both imported. Taken together, those fibres remind us that Scottish weaving was never just one craft or story. It was a rural and urban, domestic and industrial, local and global all at once. It was shaped by sheep on upland pasture, by flax fields in eastern farming districts, by imported cotton and jute arriving through imperial trade, and by the labour of spinners, dyers, weavers, millworkers, whose skill turned raw material into everyday life. The industry changed dramatically with the Industrial Revolution, yet Scotland's weaving story is not simply one of handcraft giving way to industry. What makes it distinctive is the way older and newer forms have continued to coexist. Large mills still produce luxury cloth for world markets, while small makers, heritage centres and handloom weavers keep older knowledge alive in new ways. Harris Tweed remains the clearest symbol of that continuity, a fabric shaped by modern commerce, yet still handwoven in island homes. In the end, Scottish weaving is a story of adaptation rather than disappearance. It's moved from croft and cottage to mill and studio, from necessity to fashion, from local use to global recognition, but it's never lost its connection to place, labour and identity. And that is why weaving remains such a powerful part of Scotland's cultural and economic life. Well, this has been quite a story, and I hope that you've enjoyed this canter through Scotland's weaving history. And, ladies and gentlemen, I'm now bringing this chapter of clans, tartan and weaving to a close. Before I finish off this podcast, I'd like to mention three very special people. And firstly, I want to return to the introduction where I mentioned Dan Del Merico, whose diagnosis with cancer last year has prompted him to do all those things he's ever wanted to do. Well, I'm delighted to have assisted in some small way in bringing his Scottish dream to life. I was first contacted by a great friend of Dan's, a lady called Laurie Lemon, who I clicked with immediately, especially when I discovered that both she and Dan are US Army veterans. Now, I've been a Navy veteran for 10 years now, and it's always a great pleasure to connect with fellow servicemen and women throughout the world. Dan's party consisted of Amelia, his eldest daughter, and her husband Angelo and their daughter Eliza. There was also Kathleen, his other daughter, her husband Mike, and their sons Logan and Luke, and of course Laurie Lemon. The group travelled separately from the USA, from Michigan and Maryland, and met in Edinburgh. The purpose of the trip was to make memories with family and to join the Mingus clan. It's actually spelt Menzies, Menzis, but we say Mingus. Dan served in the US Army from 1973 to 1976, during which time he trained as a small arms repairman and played tuba in a military band. He was stationed in Okinawa in 1973 to 1974, and then Fort Lewis until 1976. He then joined the Guard Reserve in 1978 to 96, and in the Guard Reserve served as a sergeant and then commissioned in 91 before retiring in 1996. On arrival in Scotland, a very good friend of mine, John Duthie, a fellow Blue Badge guide, was able to look after them, to give them an amazing tour of Scotland, and, on their return to Edinburgh, I organised a lunch for the whole family at the Royal Scots Club in Abercrombie Place. We had a super lunch, and afterwards I was able to interview the team, and I started with my fellow Blue Badge guide, John Duthie, who drove and guided them around Scotland.
John, an epic journey around Scotland. Tell me, how did it go and where did you go?
It was a splendid trip. We were basically, having been in the Stirling area, we then shot up via Castle Mingus to Inverness, up the A9, back the A82 via Oban, and taking in the sights.
Fabulous. And of course, Dan actually has an affiliation with the Castle Mingus. Your first visit, I believe.
It was, yes. Good to get another visitor attraction under the belt, despite having been at this for a while.
Great. And so you looked after these fine people. We've arrived at the Royal Scots Club. We've had a nice lunch, so I'm now just going to talk to Laurie first and then to Dan. So Laurie, you've had an amazing visit around Scotland with John Duthie, who's looked after you all this time. Just give me your first impressions, please.
Oh, I think Scotland, there's a part of it that feels like home, and it's just breathtaking. Being surrounded by nature and very reminiscent of my roots in West Virginia in the United States. I can see why my ancestors came there. Mm-hmm. It was really, I wish I could live here. I don't want to leave.
You're more than welcome, I can assure you. Thanks, Laurie. I'm just going to turn to Dan, actually, who is the main man on this mission. Dan, first of all, I've just mentioned in the beginning of the podcast that you're an army man yourself.
Yes.
How do you feel about being one of Scotland's most prestigious army clubs, the Royal Scots Club?
Well, first off, they treated us very nice here. I like seeing, I'm into history dramatically, and certainly being a regular Army and later reservist with the U.S. Army, I felt quite at home here, and they felt me very good. Mm-hmm. I should also mention my background on the great-great-great-grandfather at one point immigrated to the U.S. probably after about 1760, after one of the Jacobite losses.
Yeah.
And I'm a Mingus, and we stopped by the Mingus Castle, and I've become a Mingus clan member.
How did you find Mingus Castle?
It was interesting. I knew it was a fortified chateau. The people there were very interesting. I've got an email address for the secretary for the Mingus Society, and I will be setting up my genealogy when I get back home.
Mm-hmm. And what prompted you to come to Scotland? Was this, you've not been to Scotland before, is that right?
No, I've never been to Scotland. I wanted to bring my family over on a trip because of my health issues anyway, and I picked Scotland first. If I'm in around a year or so, then we're going to go to Italy. And I find traveling in a group is much more fun than traveling as single or something like that.
Yeah.
And like I said, my mother was a Mingus, so we always wanted to go. I have a first cousin that's a member of the society, and this is sort of like finding my roots.
You do realise, of course, that your daughters, although they may have separate or different surnames now, are still Mingus. They still belong to that clan. You realise that?
Well, and my daughter Amelia's middle name is Mingus. So my middle name is Adams, because we can trace back to that, to 16 63, the second wave of pilgrims, and but on my mother's side, both the Adamses and the Minguses.
Fantastic.
So, yeah.
And lasting memory of Scotland?
Well, I think I want to come back again. It was calm and peaceful. Everyone was wonderfully friendly, and we just have had a wonderful time.
Great stuff. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
Oh, you're quite welcome. Thank you for hosting us.
Indeed. And thank you, Laurie.
Oh, you're very welcome. Thank you. This has been a wonderful trip.
Pleasure. Absolute pleasure. Thank you very much indeed. Well, that was Dan Del Merico with Laurie, with a few comments on his tour of Scotland. And if you're listening to this, Dan, I do believe you bought a Mingus kilt. It's coloured red and black, so wear it with pride, and it'd be great to see you wearing it in Scotland one day, so you're most welcome back at any time. The second person I wish to mention is Margie Gill. You may recall from a previous podcast, John and Margie Gill from Tennessee toured with me in October 2024. Her uncle, John William King, was one of only 12 out of a crew of 74 who survived the sinking of the Liberty steamship W.H. Welsh, which foundered and sank on the northwestern coast of Scotland near Loch Ewe on the 26th of February 1944 during the Second World War. Well, we visited the Arctic Convoy Museum at Loch Ewe at the time, and they were delighted to connect with relatives of one of the only survivors. Well, on the 13th of May 2026, at the age of 101 years young, John William King, the last survivor of the tragic sinking of W.H. Welsh, passed quietly in his sleep. Rest in peace, John King, and from one sailor to another, may I wish you fair winds and calm seas. And to John and Margie Gill, thank you once more for sharing this wonderful story with me. The third person I'm going to mention is someone that followed one of my podcast tour routes. So a big shout out to Philippa and David Jasinek, who toured the North Coast 500 last week. Thank you for getting in touch, and delighted the North Coast 500 podcast helped. The only thing to do, Philippa, is please send me a photograph of one of those lovely granite obelisks with Mackay country written all over it. If you can put you and David in the photograph, I'll get it up on my social media. Well, that's it for today, folks. This podcast has been a wee extra edition due to my continuing interest in weaving, which means that on my next podcast, I'll be taking you with me on a journey that I promised to take you with me originally, and that is to the Outer Hebrides, including the island of Harris, where of course I met the famous Donald John Mackay. And thanks again, Donald, for sharing your story with us. The Outer Hebrides are quite unique, and it was quite a journey, with cancelled ferries and a bit of trouble with our vehicle as we made our way across the islands of Barra and Eriska, where Bonnie Prince Charlie landed at the start of his failed Jacobite Rising in 1745. I'll also be taking you to the Calendish Standing Stones, perhaps one of the inspirations behind Outlander for Diana Gabaldon. And I'll take you to an Iron Age dwelling known as Brochs. All of that and much more still to come. Well, as always, I've thoroughly enjoyed bringing a part of Scotland to you. I always welcome feedback, so if you'd like to comment on anything we've covered today, or if there's any aspect of Scottish life you'd like me to explore, then please do get in touch to the contact page on my website, or send me an email to john@exclusivescottishvisits.co.uk. And if you want to contribute in a small way to these podcasts, you can go to buymeacoffee.com/Unique Scotland. And before I sign off, I thought I would mention, for those that are visiting Scotland at the moment, it is actually the Durness Highland Games in Mackay country on Friday 24th of July, and I'll be there at the Clan Mackay tent, so do stop and say hello. I'll also be joining our Clan Mackay Society Secretary, Sandra Mackay, the following day, Saturday 25th of July, at the Mackay Rooms in Strathnaver Museum at Betty Hill. So do drop in for a chat, maybe even a drink and a nibble. And if you are actually a Mackay or one of our septs, then if you'd like to join Clan Mackay Society, do visit clanmackaysociety.co.uk. Well, it's been an absolute pleasure to have you with me today. I'd now like to sign off in traditional Scottish fashion by raising my glass with a wee dram to you, wherever you are in the world. Slán Java.
You've been listening to the Unique Scotland podcast with exclusivescottishvisits.co.uk. To receive all our episodes automatically, please subscribe now.